I'm Samantha Gottlieb. I am delighted to be joining you all today, and I'm going to talk about a specific product I worked on while at Fitbit to highlight the complexity of thinking anthropologically in the consumer technology space. And Heinrich gave a sort of good overview, but I'll try and go in more depth to make sure that we're sort of all on the same page. Very quickly, the agenda, I'll give a little intro about who I am. I will talk a little bit more about what Fitbit devices are and try to help map out a little the complexity of working both on hardware, which is the device that you wear on the wrist, and software, which is the mobile interface that people interact with, as well as the software on the device. I'll also discuss a high-level problem that my cross-functional team faced while we were helping Fitbit introduce a new feature, and really think about some of the implementation problems that can occur when translating algorithmic data to user-centric experience. The insights and lessons just sort of talk about some of these gaps of deprioritizing the human element of mobile experiences and how that can create confusion and frustration for people using digital tools. And I really want to sort of emphasize the missed opportunities that I think happened when Fitbit really didn't make space for some of these anthropological kinds of questions about human experience. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the difficulties of bringing these kinds of methods to corporate environments where business priorities don't always lend themselves to these kinds of intentional, deliberate questions that social scientists like to think about and ask. And I really do want to have a bit of a discussion. So I may go kind of high level for the first part of the talk, but I hope that we'll get a chance to really get into some of your questions and thoughts and reflections. And I realize it may not be as, deep understanding of Fitbit, but hopefully enough for us to have a fruitful conversation. So just a little bit about me that have nothing to do technically with research. In the last year, I've been exploring multimedia art, from oil painting to thinking about how to use embroidery to represent data. And I recently took my first art class as an adult. And I've been thinking a lot about nonverbal forms of expression. And I really love playing with colors and media. But also, it's just been really scary to do things that I've not tried before. So it's just sort of a little bit about figuring out new things at this phase of life. I've also been an avid biker since I started biking independently as a 12-year-old in Manhattan in New York City. And when I was little, younger than 12, my dad would ride me around the city on a tandem bicycle, which is a bicycle built for two. And I know for many of you in Europe, biking is quite common, but in the US, it's really grown in popularity over the last decade. And it really wasn't a common form of transport in the 20th century, late 20th century. During my dissertation work in Los Angeles, a very car-based city, I found a social community through late night organized bike rides where we got to crisscross the city. And I like showing this photo that my friend took of me when I was riding her in my large cargo bike as we were going through Oakland streets where we live last year. And then finally, for the past 2 years, as Heinrich mentioned, I've been on the board of Ethnography Praxis and Industry Community. And EPIC is a global professional organization for social scientists who use ethnography and multi-method approaches. And we're an organization that's been around for 20 years. And so we're thinking a lot about how to kind of continue for the next 20 years and how the role of researchers in industry and other organizations are evolving. And so now a little more about my expertise and my professional knowledge. So I have over 20 years of healthcare and consumer health experience. And as Heinrich mentioned, I'm trained in both public health and anthropology. From my public health training, I'm bringing critical perspectives on data assumptions, thinking about the tensions between population and individual health needs, and also the difficulty in designing impactful interventions, behavior change interventions for sort of to actually elicit change, but also to support human needs. And I really found a home in anthropology as a way to articulate the need for cultural and structural frames to support people's experience and understanding of health. I've also conducted ethnographic work to better understand US regulatory and commercial interactions, and I focus mostly on patient advocacy efforts. And then finally, the sort of topic of today, I was most recently managing Fitbit's mobile well-being experiences team, which is just a mouthful to say. I was a user researcher manager I was the most senior Fitbit leader driving Fitbit's health equity priorities. So as I'll mention, Fitbit was acquired by Google, and Google had a Google Health Equity initiative that we were sort of bringing our Fitbit perspective on. And I want to acknowledge, which I wasn't originally going to talk about, but just that my team was impacted by layoffs in October 2023. So some of what I'm talking about, this contraction in industry, is informed by that personal experience, so that's not my focus. And I'm focusing on an area of Fitbit's product development that preceded both the acquisition and some of these changes that I want to kind of touch on. And I'll focus today on the work I did in the early days of joining Fitbit in 2019 for a device known as the Fitbit Sense. Not a great name. Hopefully we'll all try to remember, because it's sort of a casual word that you might think is odd to talk about a device that way. And it hit the market in the first year of the COVID pandemic in 2020. Okay. So this is a lot of context about Fitbit, but mostly focused on the sort of high-level business context details about Fitbit. But I also want to recognize that everyone is familiar with the company or its focus. The really critical takeaway is that Fitbit is a consumer wearable device that began as a fancy pedometer, and a pedometer just tracks your steps. The device now is a watch that tracks all sorts of personal information, from heart rate to sleep cycles. And so in 2019, the time of this project, Fitbit wanted to design a new user experience for the newest Fitbit device that would include what is called an electrodermal sensor. Electrodermal sensor, which I will refer to as an EDA, the letters E, D, and A, measures sweat on the skin as a proxy for elevated emotional and psychological states. Physiological states, emotional and physiological states. So our users were used to wearing their Fitbit devices and having it measure their heart rates or tracking their steps or other activities, providing a sleep score with visualized data of sleep pattern behaviors. Users could also manually log their menstrual cycle and their food intake. But in other words, Fitbit provided its users with a lot of data, and much of it was passively tracked. And so there was not yet a stress experience on the older devices, but Fitbit did have this experience, the 2019, called Relax. And this combined the device's heart rate measurement, which is embedded in the device, with a synchronized visual on the watch screen to help people slow their breathing down. So some of you probably know through meditation or yoga, but also there's a lot of research evidence to show that slower breathing can help people engage their parasympathetic nervous system, which helps the body counter stress and agitation responses. But on the Fitbit device, to engage with Relax, users had to pause, focus on the device, and find the breathing exercises compelling enough to keep doing them. This wasn't a very popular feature. It was not sort of in the mental model of what the device was supposed to do, which is sort of, you go about your day, you have stuff tracked, you can look at the data, and suddenly there was this other activity that was supposed to help you, but you had to really be intentional and deliberate about it. And so this is just a screenshot image of kind of what it looked like on some of the older devices. So you would hit the play button, and then you would see this visual that would expand and contract, and you would be trying to match your breathing for 2 minutes to those circles. But today I'm really trying to invite a discussion of how social sciences can continue to be an important contributor to large-scale consumer-oriented products. And I bring it to this group because in my professional experience, it is not and has not been an easy challenge. And I want to acknowledge that I'm coming from a very US-based perspective. And so that's where I'm kind of thinking through and thinking with. But in the last 5 years, I've observed US-based organizations are continuing to contract their human researchers and the investments in that kind of curiosity and inquiry. And this contraction concerns me, as a human-centric culture wasn't really sufficiently embedded in many of these organizations prior to this current reduction in research teams. So I'm sort of trying to map this phenomena that I'm seeing, and that a lot of ethnographers and anthropologists and social scientists that I am both personally, like connected to, as well as professionally, that there's sort of a devastation of the landscape a bit. And some of it maybe was a false assumption that there was space for some of this kind of research in these big corporations. But I'm just sort of trying to bring this to you all to kind of think about what your own perspectives are from where you're working, but also just would love to hear kind of personal experience when we get to the discussion. So I'm focusing today on Fitbit's development of a complex feature to help users manage their stress. But I think what's interesting is it highlights how a complex conceptual problem, like what constitutes stress, how might it be simplified for easy user interactions, really requires more than the traditional product launch cycle has had as a norm. And many of the tech products that we're all using have been designed to sort of solve human experiences through digital technologies. And as many of you probably know, both personally and maybe through your research focus, um, stress is not an easy problem, quote unquote, to solve. And it's not clear that reducing it to a device interaction would really address many of the social, economic, or political causes of stress. And we might also consider whether this technological intervention is necessary, given the inevitable range of human emotions that make us human. So I think really the question is, how do we bring that anthropological and social science lens to these kinds of phenomena that are becoming increasingly digitized and abstracted? This is sort of one of my core questions. So in my time working with Fitbit across multiple projects, navigating the corporate market demands as an anthropologist could also be quite daunting. And I think as companies are turning to AI or other strategies to reduce human needs, insights, and sensitivities, those are sort of being taken out of the product development process. And so just to not bury the lead, if you have to drop early, what I proposed and what I do continue to propose really is this need for more human-centered researchers, whether they're based in UXR or other departments, that they really need to be partnered at these early stage research and development teams before products have a full conceptualization. And again, maybe in the organizations you're based in, you're already seeing that, but at Fitbit, this was a really novel proposal. And I think this is a core and tactical intervention that social scientists can bring to their organizations. I just want to pause to see if there's any urgent questions. And I'm not really following the chat, so I apologize. Okay, you'll let us know. Okay, great, thanks. So now just to kind of get an overview of stress and mindfulness, again, as I've explained in 2019, after research and development at Fitbit studied how the EDA sensor could be paired with meditation practices, the company decided to put the EDA sensor on their future launch, which would eventually be called Sense, launching in 2020. But unlike past user experience with sensors, this new one required people to put their hand over the device to measure something that Fitbit was calling stress. But the reality is that the R&D, the research and development team solutions, didn't really match how people think about or experience stress in their lives. Another really important point is that it isn't really possible for a wearable device to measure stress. So Fitbit's core data shared with users things that were like heart rate, steps, as I've mentioned, variability of sleep states. The first two, heart rate and steps, are things we all have firsthand experience with, even if we don't have a device to track these phenomena, right? We know how to measure our heart rate or at least feel our pulse. We know what a step is. We know what we move, how our body moves in space. And then sleep tracking was a huge success for Fitbit because it's an unconscious state. So it's really hard to know what's happening to us. So that was delightful for users to kind of think about, wow, I'm doing this or I'm doing that. I have no way of knowing. And then when we think about stress, stress can mean different things to different people. And unless you're in an MRI capturing brain waves or sampling cortisol levels, the experience of stress can manifest in a variety of ways. Stress is physiological, as evidenced by elevated cortisol levels, and it's psychological, which is a lot harder to observe directly without user reports of their mental states. And that's even assuming people are aware they're stressed, which we aren't always aware of our stress levels. So one possibility for what the Fitbit could have done in its early stage development would have been to ask users how they would make sense of this EDA data. But instead, the research and development team developed an algorithm, which then the product team transformed into a stress management experience to help transform the data into an interactive feature. I'm not going to have time to kind of go into all of the details of what that looked like, just because it's kind of lengthy. But I think the important part is really there was data being collected, transformed into an algorithmic analysis of what that meant. And that was really based on an algorithm the organization designed. It wasn't some kind of clinically measured algorithmic analysis. It was functionally made up. And then it was then taken and given to users to somehow make sense of what that was supposed to mean. So you can see there's a lot of forms of translation that were happening. And not only was there translation, but there was also a lot of assumptions baked into these kinds of translations. And so by the time the UXR team, of which I was the lead contributor, could elicit feedback from our users about how they understood what the data told them about their stress, there were multiple product and algorithmic decisions that had already been made about what kinds of data users saw, the way the sensor was being used, and how the experience would fit into a larger set of Fitbit products. So although the business problem was how to improve an existing feature by adding a new sensor and a new user experience, a more critical and neglected issue was that the company took a nebulous concept composed of bodily sensations, psychological states, and external factors, and then marketed a product to users as an objective interpretation of their experience. So again, I just kind of want to pause on that to think about sort of how you may think, just sort of have a chance to reflect on, like, what does that mean to kind of take your own stress experience and have it distilled into this very discrete set of numbers, as well as a set of assumptions about what that might mean, how you're supposed to interpret it, what you should do with that information, just to kind of think about it for yourself. So I put these quotations up mostly just to kind of give a little bit of a flavor of how people were responding during this pre-launch research that we were able to do. So despite the late inclusion of UXR to the product development, I was able to implement what I'm calling like mini longitudinal study. It was 30 days, so I don't know if it's really longitudinal, but during the device's field test. In the corporate world, that's very long. That's very long. A field test is when the company tests the hardware, which is the device, to make sure that the software works with the device as planned. And including UXR during this field test was not a common practice at the company prior to my arrival. Usually field test is identifying software or hardware bugs that need to be sorted out with engineering or hardware teams. So again, less about interpretation, legibility, use cases, really about like, does this work? Does it not work? What are the problems? What are the bugs? And so what quickly became clear during user research was that translating an algorithm to be a user-facing concept of stress did not help users with the experiences of stress. I know you're all shocked given how much I've led up to this. So unsurprisingly, some people have positive associations with stress. I mean, I put that quote in the middle. I kind of thought that was fascinating. You know, to me, the assumption is stress is a very negative experience. And this, I had one user, a number of users actually, who were saying it's really energizing. You know, I was like, okay, you're crazy. Sorry, not crazy, but you know, it's very different for me. And then some people use stress as a sign to motivate them to do something different. But users really weren't finding that knowing they were stressed out very helpful. And even for those who might not have been good at recognizing how they might behave when they were stressed, did not find the data as a sign very helpful. And so without thoughtful user-centered development for the stress feature, users were left with some really critical confusions and uncertainties about what they were supposed to do with the information. Another piece that I'm sort of lightly touching on here in this very sort of a lot of information was that another shift for the users was that Fitbit device this experience of stress wasn't something that they could just look at a single day of data to understand what the data meant. So again, recall that past user interactions were mostly concrete data points. X number of steps have a very embodied reference. Now, Fitbit was trying to explain experiences that touch on this wide variety of context and emotional variables. So again, people really there was a whole other pattern of thinking about what the device was supposed to be doing. And really what I also found was that even though people were trying to make sense of this information, often what would happen is they would kind of find the incongruities of the data would sort of lead them to this extra overinterpretation that often wasn't really the intention of the experience. So it sort of created this maze of sorting things out, which also let us remember that this is in the context of stress, not really the thing you need to be doing if you're trying to kind of calm yourself and find better equilibrium. So, I mean, really, I would say, I think actually this headline says it the best. This is what came out when the device, the Sense, Fitbit Sense, in-depth review all the data without the clarity. So this is a popular site for reviews of wearable technologies, and the author articulated UXR concerns in a pithy and to the point headline. I mean, I honestly was like, did he see our UXR decks? Like, what? How does he know? But I think it's really telling that, even in that sort of what the R&D team was intending, all of these attempts to kind of wedge an experience into some kind of logic and some kind of narrative, it became very clear very quickly to anyone who used this experience that it really didn't make sense. Ironically, I know its name is Sense. It didn't make sense. Yeah, awkward. And then as I've really briefly described in this specific technology product cycle, a core challenge in the wellness technology space is actionability. What should the user do next when they are using the device as a guide? And so there's this purportedly objective data, which I would argue is not usually objective. How can it act? It can actually end up confusing people. Should they believe in the information they're receiving? Is it entertainment? And like, what is the purpose of this technology? And again, I love this headline because I just feel like, well, that's it. I could have just put this up for you all, and that would have been the whole talk. So just to sort of conclude, I know I've really run through, it's hard in 20 minutes to cover all of the different phases and steps, but I thought I would show sort of our kind of product launch map to kind of help contextualize sort of what was happening in a maybe more concrete way. But I'm really showing this view also to highlight how skipping these early stages of exploring, designing, and demoing, and not including user research or other kind of social science research, is a real harm and a real risk. And in this context, I'm talking about it mostly just in like, hey, this product didn't really work very well. We didn't actively cause harm for our users, but I think we can all think of current contemporary moments in which, whether it's AI, ways in which there's real potential harm, right? This scale was perhaps discrete and small. It was a mostly entertainment device, to be perfectly honest. And yet, right there, we were talking about things that actually could be, mental health is not entertainment, right? Could have been quite serious, or at least promising to help with something that can be quite serious. So I know that there are organizations that better utilize their user research and human research teams in earlier phases. And this was a particular gap for a novel user experience. And I'm trying to show this high level representation of the product cycle, which is common in technology, but it's important to map it out and see sort of where those opportunities could have been better tapped. So again, I think I've sort of taken you through a little bit of what was happening. But I just want to recap, there was this lack of early stage user research, which made it difficult to understand how measuring stress might even fit into existing user mental models. The pre-launch timeline, which I haven't really talked about the chronology, but it was quite short. It didn't adequately allow the teams involved to collaboratively define people's worries and hopes for technological interventions into stress. And then the participant feedback, even before we were kind of available to the mass market, highlighted that these algorithms that measured user stress states failed to help people understand the very thing that they were, claiming to help change behaviors for. And then finally, even though it's obvious, probably to many on this call, data, whether it's medical information or consumer-oriented information, need to have clear steps for actionability. And we really didn't even achieve that, right? So there's sort of all these different ways that this model and this aspiration to help users really fell apart. And I think some of it is really quite tactical. And I think some of it is also sort of conceptual as well. And I know we're kind of hitting up against time. So I just want to reiterate sort of this tension that I've highlighted today is not just to criticize the business priorities that most companies face, regardless of size, because that critique maybe doesn't really get us anywhere. But I think it is to ask all of you here to reflect on how your professional environments do or don't make space for critical social science reflection. I'd really love to hear more from all of you about the ways that you've successfully navigated some of these pressures to bring a social science lens to your professional endeavors, or things that haven't worked that you have tried, just more out of a sort of interest in knowledge sharing and sort of thinking about where kind of people can come together with an orientation of social scientists, to these kinds of environments. And, again, I know this was a very high level discussion of product decisions and research needs. Um, I have a few questions to ask all of you, but I'd really like to open the discussion to questions, areas that I can clarify, and hope that that will launch us into a more collective discussion. Thank you.